In March 2020, Boris Johnson's government encouraged us all to clap for our carers. In March 2021, they've delivered a slap for our carers. Yes, after fighting on the front line of the coronavirus pandemic, Britain's NHS staff are being offered a mere 1% pay rise, a figure that's unlikely to keep up with inflation. I'll be talking in one moment about that announcement to Dave Carr, an intensive care nurse. And throughout tonight's show, I'm delighted to be joined by gal-dem's Moya, Lothian-McClean. Dahlia is under the weather today, but I'm delighted to have Moya on tonight to fill her shoes. How are you doing, Moya?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to wear Dahlia's shoes.
She probably has pretty good shoes, to be fair.
Yeah,
you might know Moya from her brilliant articles at gal-dem, but if you only get your news from Novara, which in a way I kind of hope some of you do, maybe, from my own ego, for the sort of company's strength, you might recognize Moya from the brilliant interview she did with Ash a few weeks ago about influencers. We are talking about so much on tonight's show, not just that pitiful 1% pay rise, but also I will be joined by James Meadway for some post-budget analysis. We'll also talk about Keir Starmer poor polling. I'll be joined by Daniel Caie, who is on day 27 of the British gas strike. And we will finish by telling you about the latest gaffes from the Tories candidate for London Mayor. There really is something for everyone, which means it's all the more important to share the show link, tweet on the hashtag Tysky Sour, comment on the Twitch stream, and send us your YouTube super chats. Now, for the past 12 months, NHS staff have been putting themselves day in, day out on the front line in the fight against COVID. Many have become sick, and tragically, according to the Office for National Statistics, over 850 health and social care workers have now died of COVID-19. It's no surprise then that thanking NHS staff has become a staple of political interventions in Britain, from clapping for our carers, whatever you need, that's what you're going to get. Remember that line. You'll probably also remember this video released by Boris Johnson after he was discharged from intensive care, having been treated himself for coronavirus.
I want to thank the many nurses, men and women, whose care has been so astonishing. I'm going to forget some names, so please forgive me, but I want to thank Poling and Shannon and Emily and Angel and Connie and Becky and Rachel and Nikki and Anne. And I hope they won't mind if I mention in particular two nurses who stood by my bedside for 48 hours when things could have gone either way. They're Jenny from New Zealand, Invercargill on the South Island to be exact, and Luis from Portugal near Porto. And the reason in the end my body did start to get enough oxygen was because for every second of the night, they were watching and they were thinking and they were caring and making the interventions I needed.
Now, that's, of course, a nice enough message, one no reasonable person can really disagree with. But unfortunately, health workers can't pay their rent with Twitter videos, and claps aren't accepted in supermarkets as legal tender. So throughout this pandemic, health workers have been clear to thank nurses, fund the NHS properly, and offer them a pay rise. It was therefore a slap in the face to many when the government announced this morning they would be recommending only a 1% pay increase for NHS staff. Obviously, this is a pitiful nominal increase amounting to only an extra £3.50 more per week in take-home pay for an experienced nurse. Even worse, in real terms, given inflation is predicted to reach 1.5% this year, NHS staff are in effect being asked to take a pay cut. To discuss this announcement, I'm delighted to be joined by intensive care nurse Dave Carr. Can you tell me how you felt when you heard this announcement?
Since this pandemic started, you're lost for words on the performance of the government. Rishi Sunak, Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson. Breathtaking gaffe after breathtaking gaffe after, you know, ridiculous eat out to help out, late lockdowns, you know, test, trace and track, isolate that never worked, you know, unis back at the same time as people going back to work and schools not prepared, 5 days of Christmas, you know, a late circuit break. Every time we saw this happening as health workers, we're thinking, these people don't know what they're doing. You know, these people are making a hash of everything. These people are making our jobs so much harder in the NHS, and especially Rishi Sunak. I mean, I think we should single him out, because they talk about, don't they? They talk about it's a choice between paying the health workers or people keeping their jobs or you know, and having livelihoods. And yet, without that, what he did over the summer wrecked the economy to the extent that it's, you know, they're now taking it out on us and other public sector workers. And you know, it's. I'm just you can see I'm just lost for words. I'm just lost for words on the way these people have behaved. So, lost for words was how I felt this morning when I heard this. Not surprised, really angry. But I tell you what, I have been hearing a lot of from my staff at work is humiliation. Yeah, and I think that's something we need to discuss. Maybe people feel they've been humiliated by the government with this 1% offer. It's calculated. You know, you offer someone 1%, it's akin to saying you are absolutely worthless in our eyes. And I think that's how we feel. Really angry, really upset, and humiliated.
Well, now you've told me you're angry, I'm feeling bad about the next clip I'm going to show, which is Nadine Dorries explaining this decision. So Nadine Dorries is a health minister, and she this morning on Sky explained the decision to offer only a 1% pay rise to healthcare staff.
Of course, we recognise the sacrifice and the commitment and the vocation of nurses and all health workers over the past year. We've all been touched by, or personally experienced by, help from NHS workers. But I think it's important to note that the priority of the government has been about protecting people's livelihoods, about continuing the furlough scheme, about fighting the pandemic. And we've put huge effort into that. And we did not want nurses to go unrecognised, or doctors, and no other public sector employee is receiving a pay rise. There has been a pay freeze. But the 1% offer is the most we think we can afford, which we have put forward to the pay review body. That will be discussed. We will wait for feedback from unions and other health sector stakeholders and see where we move to on this. But the 1% is what the government can afford. It's what the offer is. And, you know, it would be wrong to say that a single person in the government does not appreciate the effort of nurses. We absolutely do.
So, Dave, what did you make of that particular interview? She's saying there that, you know, 1% might not be much, but it's better than the rest of the public sector who are getting a freeze, and this is the most they can possibly afford.
I think I would have preferred to have been offered nothing along with the rest of the public sector than to have this offer of 1%, and then to have us pitted against other public sector workers who incidentally did get a pay rise last year. But I think this is, you know, it's not just about us in the health service, it's about the rest of the public sector. I can't tell you how it makes you feel as a health worker watching the platitudes from these people and watching their smarmy way that they have of explaining away these decisions, you know, sitting in their well-appointed houses on their big fat MP salaries. I mean, Rishi Sunak is a rich man. He's a millionaire. You know, Boris Johnson, you know, a rich man. These people they don't know what it's like to live our life. So that when you're told we can't afford it, you know, the country can't afford it, it's nothing to do with what they can't. If they chose to value health, if they chose to value public sector, like the Tories never have, then they would find the money, like they find the money for anything else they want to pay for. You know, like they discovered the magic money tree at various times in, you know, during the last few years when they need it for their own ends. I think what's really concerning to me is that we have to look at what's happening to the NHS in the whole, the privatisations, the cuts in services, the disjointed nature of services. My partner works in women's services, and they've been devastated over the last 10 years. She works in sexual health, and there's not a joined up system. you know, public health has been really decimated. Social care has been decimated, and now we can see what's going on in terms of the pressure that's put on the acute care that I work in. Short-staffed, constantly, you know, morale always low in the NHS. Hospitals periodically, you know, not able to cope with what's going on because, you know, they're just not properly funded. The NHS is about human beings like myself, like nurses, radiographers, porters, cleaners. All of us staff are the NHS. We are the NHS. And, you know, if you can't afford a health service, if you can't afford to pay the people that constitute the health service, then what that's telling you is that they don't value the health service. You know, the pandemic's dealt with now, the vaccinations are around, we haven't got to worry about this. It's almost like, right, well, you know, that's our asses pulled out of the fire, stuff them, you know, 1%, you know, it's better than everyone else is getting. So I think that this offer to us is a portent of a real deterioration in the service that we can give, because I've been working in critical care now for a long time as a career, but in the last year I've seen some stuff that I shouldn't have seen, and I've made some phone calls and held some hands with people that couldn't have their loved ones with them when they were passing away. But the outcome of what we did with the pandemic in both waves was to stop a large proportion of what the NHS does normally, which is the service that people require of it. And now we're expected to go back after the ravages of the pandemic are still with us. There's still a lot of people in my ITU, and deal with the demands on the NHS with this extra load of work that's been put us and these patients that have got sicker. So I think the 1% offer to us is an insult. It's a stab in the front, stab in the back, kick up the anything you can think of. It's that. But it's also more than that. I think this is really dangerous for the future of the NHS if we're not recognised at this point in the history of the NHS.
So let's talk about what next. I know the Royal College of Nurses, they're calling for 12.5%, obviously a lot more than the 1%, and they are already setting up a £35 million strike fund. So from your perspective, from speaking to your colleagues, how likely do you think that strike would be? Are you confident you could win it? And I suppose also, would you be willing to settle for anything less than 12.5%?
Well, I'm part of a campaign that's going for 15%, and I think you've got to set the bar high. And I think 15% would just about cover what I've lost in the last 10 years. My real term salary has been cut by £2,500 in the last 10 years because of below inflation pay rises and changes to the way we work. So strike action, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, you know, one of the senior nurses in my hospital said to myself and one of my colleagues, I won't mention her name, but she said to me, "My God, I hope the government offer you a lot of decent pay rise, because the last thing we want after this pandemic is a big strike on our hands. And you lot deserve a pay rise, and we'll know you'll strike if you're not given one." And I think that it's almost like it's almost like the military covenant, if you like. We did the pandemic. And I, as an ITU nurse, and the rest of us in critical care, work way beyond our capacity. I mean, we could spend hours talking about how care was compromised and how we managed to ameliorate the worst effects of that. We could talk about how, you know, for 8 days in a row, we created intensive care units out of thin air because the demand of patients coming into the hospital was so ferocious. I could talk, you know, for ages about how we went from 1-to-1 care, which is intensive care, to 1-to-2, to 1-to-3, to 1-to-4, and in some cases 1-to-5, 1-to-6. And, you know, my priority was to make sure those patients stayed alive where I could. You know, I could talk about that you know, that for ages. And I think that in terms of what we expect now is we've done that. And we expect some payback for that, if you like. You know, we've done COVID, and now we want, the land fit for heroes, if you like, after the war. We want to be rewarded for the fact that we compromised ourselves, sacrificed our lives, compromised every aspect of our careers, worked so hard to make sure the public was safe. But it's not just about my money in my pocket. If we don't get a pay rise, we won't keep staff in the NHS. and the NHS will continue to crumble, it will continue to fail, and it will be open to the vultures that want to privatise it. You look at the way Hancock set up that private test, trace, track system, which was a complete disaster. That would have paid for our pay rise. You know, the money that they can, you know, backhand into their next door neighbours, you know, accounts for PPE contracts, and Dido Harding running the test, trace and track. I mean, the money's there. If they want to spend it on us, it's there, but they don't want to spend it on us because they don't value us, because what are we? We're just public servants. So strike action is exactly what we're after now, because they're not listening to anything else we say. So the only thing we can do is concentrated industrial action across the entire sector. And actually, I want to talk to teachers, I want to talk to firefighters, I want to talk to other public sector workers, but I also want to talk to people that have been furloughed, whose jobs have been compromised by Rishi Sunak's ridiculous handling of the coming out of a lockdown too early. I want to talk to about people that can't afford to isolate. I want to talk to those people that work Uber, that have been delivering food all over this period. We want to have a united campaign around the NHS, with us as the driving force, if you like, saying, right, we are the NHS, the staff in it is the NHS, we need the NHS survival, we need you to support us. But we won't forget, you know, the people that supported us during the pandemic. And these were, you know, the local people that gave us food, the local fire service stations that you know, like donated money to us when we didn't really need it, donated time to us. You know, all of the goodwill that we got from the communities, the teachers who took that action not to go back into school too early. And actually that action saved thousands, tens of thousands of lives. I mean, you know, the fact that the teachers had to take that action to take the hand of the government off of the levers it was playing with. They picked a fight with a big family. You know, the NHS is a big family, and we intend to preserve the NHS. You know, we're fighting for the NHS and the service that we deliver. But we're, you know, Neil Doris talked about this being a vocation. You know, it's a job. It's a really hard job, and I'm really proud and privileged that I look after people that are ill and do my best to save them. But actually, it's a valued job. It's a really skilled job. It's a really important job. Not just my job, but the cleaners. We've got cleaners that have to come to work on the night bus because they can't afford the tube. It's an absolute disgrace in a land where the rich getting as rich as they are, and us getting shat upon from a great height by the UK government after they put us in harm's way and are directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of UK citizens. Yeah, you know, a strike is the least they're going to get out of us.
Dave Carr, I've got to say, that campaign you describe, I think, is exactly what this country needs right now. And I can see lots of messages of solidarity in the comments as well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. All of our solidarity, and thank you for everything you do.
Thanks so much. And what I'd like to, just before I chip off, there's, you know, I'm one of these nurses that I retired and I came back into the NHS. I had 2 days off before I packed in. You know, I retired on the 19th of April and I was back on the front line on the 21st. So I'm an old boy. You know, I've done a long time in the NHS. But what's amazing about the campaign that we're running now, and this is what I'd really like to get you guys involved in it, is, you know, the amount of young health workers, black, white, you know, the Black Lives movement really had a major impact on what was going on inside our hospital and the confidence it gave people. The Me Too movement, everything has led, if you like, to this point now where all of these different threads are coming together. And we'd love to work with you guys to actually get our message across, because it's very difficult to get it across in the mainstream media. So anyway, I'll shut my gob now. Angry health worker.
No, let's definitely be in touch, because I want to be a part of this campaign. Dave, thank you so much. Good night.
See you later. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Let's go to a couple of comments. Sparky Taggart with a huge £100 super chat. Thank you so much. A second Pfizer jab bonus for you after a year of self-isolation. Thanks for keeping me sane. That is lovely on so many levels. Thank you so much for that really kind donation. But also, I am so delighted to hear that you've got your second Pfizer jab. So many people have, you know, been isolated for 12 months now. I can't, you know, obviously the lockdown's been difficult for everyone, but it has been more difficult for certain people if they've had to shield, for example. Shailendra Singh with £16.42. Thank you so much. The wonderful David Graeber summarised this phenomenon so accurately. The more valuable your work is to society, the less you'll be paid for it. Seems like a foundational tenet of Toryism to me. And we've got someone else who's got their Pfizer vaccine today, Multi21 with a £5 super chat. Thank you so much. Got my Pfizer vaccine today. Thanks for all you do. I'd go mental otherwise. Thank you so much, and we're very pleased to be here to stop you going mental. I suppose, I don't know if that's politically correct or whatever, but thank you. Moya, I want to bring you in for comment on that interview. This seems, on the one hand to be, what are the Tories thinking? They're riding high in the polls, and they've decided to pick a fight with probably the most popular group of people in Britain right now, NHS workers. At the same time, I'm already getting those worrying echoes of sort of like, you're all getting 0%, so why should they be not grateful for 1%? There's this sort of divide and rule strategy that, whilst, I'm not convinced it's going to work, it gets me worried. What do you think about it?
It's interesting because, yes, NHS workers are probably the most popular group of people in the country, but that didn't serve them last summer when they were even more popular, and we all recognise their value, and all they got was a clap then. I think the most we were able to push through to aid NHS workers at that time was allowing the families of workers who'd migrated from elsewhere to get bereavement funds and access those, and that took a lot of effort. So the problem with this is that the Tories know what they're doing, and they've been doing it very well for a long time. So it's returning to that old sort of like playbook. I think we can't afford to have this strong economy and pay our workers a decent wage, and it relies on public ignorance of what government spending and budget is. So I think it was Professor Charles Adams of Durham Uni, he put it as, the government debt means people are saving, and soon people spend money, the government get that money back so that they can spend on public services through taxation, etc. So, and at the moment, I think it's record low interest rates because of the COVID pandemic. So there is very little risk at putting increasing wages for the likes of key workers. The Tories just don't want to do it, because then they'd have more questions about why they're not increasing workers for everyone else. I think there was a recent study which showed that there's an illusion of wage growth in this country, which is actually because the lowest paid jobs have just fallen out of society altogether because of the pandemic. They've just bottomed out, so they don't even exist on the sort of median scale anymore. So it looks like wages have gone up. They haven't. Jobs have just disappeared. So I don't know what's going to happen, to be honest, because there's these strikes being encouraged, which is amazing. Would love a strike, and we've got the slow clap protest. But last year we saw the same thing with the teaching unions. They said, if we get sent back to school, we're going to strike. We can't do this, and still they're getting so much crap for that. Like one Daily Mail headline from February alone reads this: teaching unions are accused of hijacking the pandemic to push for pay rises and long-term perks under key demands to reopen schools. So that's how we're treating teachers, who are also one of those classic key worker groups on the front line, who we've been like, yes, we couldn't do this without them. So I don't know. I would love to think that finally, the things that Dave were talking about, they're sort of like linking up of different marginalized groups within the NHS, and that solidarity narrative is being realized on a wider scale. I don't know if it is.
I mean, it is striking how quickly we've gone from, we're in a once in a lifetime pandemic, let's build back better afterwards, to instantly, actually, sorry, we can't afford to pay key workers more. That's just the way it is. Divide and rule, same old Tory politicians. We have 1,700 people watching. To share the show link to get that up to 2,000 tonight. It's a Friday night, but you've got no excuse not to be watching Tysky Sale, because there's nowhere else you're allowed to be. Next story. It's often only in the days after a budget is announced that the awkward details in the document gain political salience. That was the case when Gordon Brown abolished the 10p tax band, or when George Osborne planned to cut working tax credits. So, 2 days on, are there any unpopular policies in Sunak's budget which were initially overlooked, but that could ultimately stick to the otherwise Teflon Chancellor? Well, Labour seem to be hoping the pork barrel politics of the Towns Fund might just be one of them. The story here is that of the 45 towns chosen to benefit from a £1 million regeneration fund, 40 of them will go to areas with a Tory MP. Keir Starmer yesterday suggested this was all a little suspicious.
We have no issue with areas getting funding. Of course, we need funding across the whole of the United Kingdom. We've had a decade where the economy has been stalling. There needs to be investment. We all want to see that funding going in, but it's got to go in properly to the areas that most need it, and it's got to go in a transparent way. And if you end up with a list of 45 areas where the funding's going in, and by coincidence, 40 of them are where there's a Conservative MP. I think most people are saying, what's going on here? This looks fishy.
To discuss whether the Towns Fund really is fishy, I'm joined by James Meadway, who needs no introduction because he's a Novara Media columnist and a friend of the show. James, as the details of the Towns Fund emerge, is Sunak's budget starting to unravel?
It may be. Look, you've touched on one of the other parts of this, which is this 1% pay settlement for NHS nurses and other NHS workers. I mean, this is the product of Sunak presenting quite a tight set of planned spending over the next sort of year. He hasn't really said where this spending is going to land. That's all saved up for what they call the spending review, which is in autumn, which will most likely be the next sort of 3 years. The government will try and lay out what it's going to spend on what. And what's interesting around this, I think in particular, is that there was a load of pressure on public spending that was appearing anyway. We have an older population, we have more demands in the NHS, more demands for social care, more people receiving a pension, that sort of thing. You then throw in coronavirus and all the kinds of long-term impacts of this. The fact that the thing is going to be around for many years. The fact that you have so many people with long COVID requiring treatment for a long period of time. And this is a really sort of big, hidden, unpleasant story, I think, in the whole thing. Stack all that up, you need to spend more money just to stand still. So at the minute, the Tories, if you go and dig into the figures, the Tories are set to spending more by 2023-24, about 42% of GDP, more in that year than in every single year of the last Labour government before the financial crisis. So they are set to spend more, but there's more demands and everything. And that's the kind of the problem that they've run hard up against. There are buried away in the budget also some cuts to planned spending. There's another £4 billion cut off planned spending. So it's quite a sort of mix of different things he's got coming out of this. You've got to bear in mind, whatever else happens, they are Tories and there are certain kind of priorities that they have and things they're going to want to do, and you know how it's going to look. But what I thought was interesting about the budget was they may be Tories, but there are variants on the theme of this, and the fact that he was going to turn around and do this, and as you can see the polling, enormously popular increase in corporation taxes, particularly aimed at big corporations. Then throw on top of that this basically big giveaway to companies that will invest in equipment, right? Which is something we've not seen in this country. We haven't seen any increases in corporation tax for over 40 years. And we haven't seen governments say to companies, if you invest in like factory equipment or equipment in general, tangible assets rather than intangible assets, you'll get a kind of bonus. Now, just to be clear, this is a bonus that's going to go to large corporations, right? That's how the thing's going to play out. But it's a big steer to try and get them to do a certain kind of investment. It's a turn away from the sort of very financialized, financial services focused setup of the last 40 years or so. So that was quite a dramatic thing, I thought. And obviously the politics of it plays very well. I mean, it's such a mistake, I think, for Labour to oppose the corporation tax rise, because people are very happy to see corporations pay more in taxes. And the Tories now say they're going to do this. So there's a lot going on in the budget. There's a sort of short-term hope that things might fall apart at some point in the next few days. And this 1% pay increase, it looks like quite a key moment for that. The pork barrel Towns Fund could be another. But actually, to me, it also looks like the Tories are trying to set up quite a long-term argument about where they want to get to for the economy here.
Yeah, we're going to look at a video now of Rishi Sunak, because on the pork barrel issue, which Labour are trying to make an issue of, and the Financial Times have as well, he seems quite comfortable. I want to take a look at his explanation of what's going on.
I want to talk to you about the Towns Fund, £1 billion of investment, 47 of the 56 constituencies Conservative. Let me put some statistics to you. Loughborough, one of the towns that will benefit from this. Child poverty is at 11%, unemployment at 3.7%. Compare it to Salford, where child poverty is at 20%, unemployment is at 8%. What criteria were you looking at when you allocated this money?
Well, there's a range of criteria that are looked at to make sure that we can help regenerate places that are in need, and that's how these decisions are made. And we're standing here, as you said, we're in Teesside.
What are those criteria?
Today.
Because twice as many children are living in poverty in Salford, twice as many people are unemployed.
That's just one thing. If you look at, for example, unemployment rates, historic investment that people have had, there's a range of criteria that are taken into account. In the same way, when we were thinking about Freeport locations, we look at the area's unemployment rate, for example. We look at the deliverability of the bid. So you've seen 8 different regions benefit from free ports, whether it's Liverpool, Southampton or Teesside where we are. But what we mean is we want to get money to places where we want to level up opportunity. That's what we promised to do when we were elected a couple of years ago. We're making good on that promise. So whether that's here in Teesside or elsewhere, we want people to feel that wherever they live, wherever they're growing up, opportunity is coming to them, investment is coming to them.
Now, he might not look, a natural in an oversized high-vis jacket, but he certainly seemed quite comfortable in that conversation. I was wondering what you thought, James, about whether or not this pork barrel issue, and it's called pork barrel. I don't actually know why it's called that, but it's from American politics, where you've got Congress people who always add an addendum to a bill, which is to say, just send some money to my district, please, so I get re-elected. That's where the word comes from. Do you think this is an argument that he's actually really happy to be having? Because basically you've got the opposition saying you're sending money to towns that voted for you at the last election, which is not necessarily what you want to be shouting if they're precisely the towns you're trying to win back.
Well, that's a fair point. Pork barrel, I think, comes from an American children's story in like the 1860s. That you kind of hand out the pork to people who ask for it, and this is like it's one of these American things we kind of copied over here, but it's quite a graphic metaphor in any case. If we're all arguing about the Tories are spending money, then this is probably not too bad for the Tories to have that as a thing. I would prefer us to have an argument about why are we not doing more to deal with the enormous profits that some companies have made over the last year? Why are we not doing something to tax wealth? For instance, equalising, a simple thing, equalising the amount you pay in income tax with the amount you pay on capital gains tax. Capital gains tax mostly paid, overwhelmingly paid by very wealthy people. IPPR estimates this will be £90 billion that you'd raise from doing this over 5 years, right? If you want a pay rise for anybody working in the NHS that's not 1%, that isn't taking a piss, then this is a good way to start thinking about that. We're not talking about these things, we're getting into some of the niggly details. There isn't a big picture story about the alternative here. So instead we're talking about the details of the Tories' big picture story, right? And their big picture story is, here's some money for these places that haven't had so much money for so long yet because the Tories have been in government for 10 years. But we're still talking about their stories, not ours.
You were scrambling a little bit there, James, but we're going to... I'm going to keep you on because we're going to go to Starmer in a moment, and I want all of your thoughts on that. For now, I want to show you, our audience, something that's, I suppose, worrying for many people who don't want to see decades of Tory rule, which is that of this budget, which it's becoming apparent now is going to imply, very miserly or insulting pay increases for NHS staff. Of that budget, YouGov has found that 55% think it was fair. I think the budget was fair, and just 16% think it was unfair. Now, this is the highest rating recorded in the 12 years that YouGov have been asking this question. So you can see there on the graphic, the last 12 years, and by a long way, this is the budget which people think is the most fair. Whether or not that sort of understanding of the budget continues to be dominant will depend a lot more on the next man. We're moving on to Keir Starmer's poor polling. Now, by focusing on attacking the left instead of the Tories, Keir Starmer has royally pissed off Labour members. Now, new polling suggests the public aren't impressed with the Labour leader either. YouGov's latest voting intention poll suggests the Conservatives have a 13-point lead over Labour. So the Conservatives are on 45%, which is +4 from last February or late February, and Labour are on 32%, which is down 4 from that same date. Now, as you can see from the YouGov Westminster voting intention tracker, this is the biggest gap that we have seen since last May, when, and that was obviously, of course, before Dominic Cummings' infamous trip to Barnard Castle. Now, this surge in support for the Tories, of course, we can't ignore the fact that the vaccine rollout is going well. It's probably has a lot to do with that. At the same time, Keir Starmer has been having lots of personal problems of his own making over the past few weeks, whether that be indecision, a lack of substance, or the general impression of being driven by opportunism. And all of these problems were foreseen by one of my guests tonight, who in December labelled Keir Starmer a wet wipe. It was a story that apparently got under his skin. Moya, do you think this poor polling is not necessarily caused by the article you've written, but do you think that the wider public are like you, recognising that Keir Starmer is a little bit of a wet wipe.
I mean, it's quite clear that for people who were paying attention earlier, such as who unfortunately it's our jobs to pay attention, that this man was someone who perhaps didn't know what he stood for himself. And I think that's the problem with Keir Starmer. He's someone who has only been a politician since 2015, so he's vastly inexperienced at this job, and it's amazing that he was even elected Labour leader. And I think it's because his background as a lawyer, you know, as a QC, he's a knight of the realm, gave him this sheen of almost being more prepared for the gig than he was. People didn't really know where he came from. He was a new face almost, and he spoke, I wouldn't say a good game, because he didn't do anything to really convince the existing Labour members, but there wasn't so much as, I wouldn't say there was stiff competition. So he spoke a game during his campaign to be Labour leader, and immediately set about not doing anything he promised, which never goes well. Another YouGov poll recently, I think on 15th of February, found that 41% of people now think that Starmer is doing badly as Labour leader, whilst 35% think he's doing well. This is the first time that those two lines have crossed. So for the first time now, his ratings are overall negative compared to before, where it was overall positive. And it's only going to get worse the more the vaccine rolls out. And his Labour frontbench, the problem is a frontbench under Starmer shows a lack of vision that is not distinct from the Tories in any way. They merely sort of exist to not oppose in a strange way. For example, 1 million more people are now going to be paying income tax by 2026. And the Labour frontbench has supported that in principle, while simultaneously opposing an immediate rise in corporation tax. It just doesn't make any sense. Like, it just does not make any sense. His approach seems to be throw as many beige ideas at the wall and hope that something sticks. And the problem is it's both contradictory, so you don't get any trust there. And it also lies a lack of vision. So no one knows what your bigger aim is. And at this point, there was such an open goal to set out a vision. You know, post-pandemic, we could have had this really big, ambitious plan from Labour. It's the perfect time. It's like, if we want to go into the war metaphors, it's the 1945 classic rebuild a new state. But Labour didn't do that. They just sort of been like, now's not the time for policy, but also we have policies, but we're just not saying them. And yeah, just gradually rise corporation tax, don't tax the big businesses. They can't even, there's an open goal on things like corporation tax, and they can't even shoot it in. They're like Arsenal at the moment, which is Keir Starmer's team. So yeah, all in all, really poor. I think that he won't be Labour leader by the next election. I think he might not even be Labour leader by the end of the year if the 6th of May goes poorly.
Maybe he is taking inspiration from Arsenal. I should say, Labour are drawing upon the 1945 analogy, but they're just doing it in speeches which no one reads because they don't contain anything else that's interesting. So it's all very well, as Keir Starmer is saying, we need, like in 1945, to build a future that's completely unlike the past. But then you have to fill that out, and you fill that out with the decisions you make. And the decisions he's making is to still remain on the fence. I do want to show a clip of him this morning, though, because I mean, it seems to me that he's been waiting for the Tories to make mistakes which he thinks are completely uncontroversial for him to oppose. And it seems to be that this 1% pay rise for healthcare workers is something that he has recognised as something which is a win-win to oppose. It is uncontroversial enough to stand up for a higher pay rise for healthcare workers, even though he won't say exactly how high it should be. In any case, let's take a look at him speaking about this issue to the BBC this morning.
Public sector workers should get a pay rise. They shouldn't have their pay frozen. They have been keeping our country going throughout this pandemic, and it is absolutely wrong to freeze their pay at this time. At the same time, by the way, as giving Dominic Cummings a massive pay rise, 40% pay rise.
So all public sector workers should get an above-inflation pay rise.
We
have
repeatedly said that the freeze on public sector pay is wrong. We've challenged the government on it. I challenged them in the budget response on it, and we'll continue to challenge them on it.
So you want pay rises for everyone. You don't want any tax rises. Is that financially responsible?
We have to have a plan for the future to rebuild the foundations of our country. You don't do that by freezing the pay of those on the front line throughout this pandemic, public sector workers, whilst at the same time giving people like Dominic Cummings a pay rise. That is the wrong priorities.
But is your position financially responsible?
Look, You have got to reward those on the front line who have been keeping our country going for the last 12 months or more, and freezing their pay is a pay cut for them. That is wrong in principle.
But Sir Keir, obviously the country has built up a huge amount of debt because of coronavirus. So just if you could address that question, if you're saying pay rises for all public sector workers, no tax rises, is that responsible? What
I'm saying is what we need now is for a recovery as swiftly as possible. And you don't build that recovery by cutting expenditure and by putting up taxes. That is the wrong thing to do.
Now, those interviews often look a bit awkward because basically both the interviewer and the interviewee is trying to get a 10-second clip for the news bulletins at 12 or 6 or 10. So that's why it can seem very repetitive. It's not necessarily a bad thing that he seemed so repetitive in that answer. James, I want to bring you in for the content on this one, for the substance of what Keir Starmer was saying, because you've been writing persuasively that Labour can't pretend they're fighting the Tories of the 2010 era, because this isn't a Tory government which is as interested in austerity as George Osborne was. But at the same time, when it comes to public services, kind of are they? And can Keir Starmer legitimately fall back on that sort of safe ground for Labour to just say, look, what we do differently is we'd treat public sector workers and we'd fund public services better than the Tories are doing?
Yeah, they can do that and they should do that, but I'll take that as a sort of bare minimum of what you might expect Labour to be doing. It's sort of the problem they have, and I'm going to slightly repeat myself here and do a bit of a Keir Starmer moment if I'm not careful, but the problem they have is that this is the minimum thing you're doing, and you're basically opposing the government, which is what you do if you're the opposition, and then at no point are you laying out how this is going to look in the future. What the Tories have realised, and I reckon they got wind of this, at least in public, from about September last year, is that coronavirus isn't going away, not anytime soon. And the impact of this is therefore very, very long term, and it changes what you can do on the economy. Suddenly every question on the economy goes from being like, how do we manage the economy better? Oh, well, let's fine tune this tax, or don't do that tax, or whatever. The kind of stuff, frankly, that Labour wants to talk about a little bit too much right now. And instead, they're starting to lay out a kind of political reshaping of the economy, because that's what the crisis has opened up. Like any big crisis, after 2008, there was this opportunity to reshape the economy politically. And what we got was austerity. It's political reshaping of the economy. So no longer just managerial stuff. You're kind of trying to alter what the economy itself looks like one way or the other. And austerity meant shrinking the state over time. So they have this opportunity. The Tories have grasped that. That's why they're doing things like this corporation tax increase, why they're throwing around lots and lots of other pots of money and doing different things all over the place. They got that sense of it. It's building on what they were moving towards anyway, but they've got that sense of it. Labour don't have that. So they have this basic fallback position saying we should pay more to NHS staff, and we should absolutely do that. The crunch will come, by the way, if Labour have to support a strike, and I would like to see them do that, but let's see where they get to on this. So that's the minimum of what to do. What they need to be doing is getting to the politics of what does rebuilding out of coronavirus, or with this endemic coronavirus that we're going to have, actually look like? What are the jobs that people are going to be doing? Why, for instance, they're not talking about building a national care service and overhauling how we do care work in this country? It's massively underpaid. It's been hit appallingly in the last year. It's been squeezed for years in funding. They could really go out and lead in this, and they're not. It's just this continual on the back foot, responding to what the Tories are doing, not trying to shape the kind of arguments we could be having about all of this.
It's a bit of a disappointment, isn't it? James Meadway, you were not a disappointment. You're never a disappointment. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you.
If you haven't already, do like the stream. It helps us on the algorithm. Now, today is the 27th day of strike action by British gas engineers, who are fighting a threat by the company to fire and rehire them on worse terms. Now, the dispute revolves around a number of conditions in the new contract, which reduce workers' rights on the job without guaranteeing any extra pay. Yet again, bosses expect to be granted something for nothing. However, there were suggestions this weekend strike could have been called off. That was after British Gas and GMB, who represent the workers, entered negotiations at the government's conciliation service, ACAS. Now, that new deal, on which the union stayed neutral, so they didn't recommend workers to vote either for or against, that was put to workers in a ballot, and yesterday we learnt the outcome. workers voted by 79% and on an 88% turnout to reject the offer. Hence, the strike continues. Daniel Caie is a British gas engineer who has written for Tribune this week on the strike, and he joins me this evening. Welcome to Tysky Sour.
How's it going?
So you've been on strike for 27 days now. That's a significant strike. Can you start by explaining what it is about the new contracts that you and your colleagues are so opposed to?
Essentially, the reason for the strike is fire and rehire. So if fire and rehire gets called off tomorrow, then we'll return to work. The reason they've employed fire and rehire is because the contract is overtly unfair. So the main headline figure is that our average week is 7 hours. They want to move it to 40, but without uplifting our wages. So had you expressed intention to sign the contract by Christmas last year, being given $2,000 as a one-off payment, basically this was their way of saying, that's you're now on the 40-hour contract, and this will tide you over, basically, which is poor show because it doesn't even equate to 9 months of extra wages, never mind the rest of your career. And the thing with British Gas is that there's so many guys that joined from leaving school and they stay right the way through to retirement. There's guys I work with 20, 30, 40 years experience. So to have that laid at the door during a pandemic of all things, I mean, I think the biggest kick in the gut is that we've been going into the homes, all throughout, and none of us complain about it. We just go and do our job. But to have this, threatened against us whilst we're, potentially working in COVID positive homes, it's horrible, really. So the main headline figure is basically the uplift in hours working a week without paying for it. So had you not expressed intention to sign by Christmas, then you were on your own, so that they were saying, right, we're not going to give you any money. So anyway, the strikes began in January, and around about 3 weeks ago, the union and British Gas got around the table again with ACAS to discuss how to move forward.
I want to know a bit about the organising of this strike, because, I mean, as you're describing, fire and rehire is fire and rehire. It's a very threatening thing for a company to say. Unless you accept this, you won't get these bonuses we're offering you purely for accepting this. And if you ultimately don't accept this, you're going to lose your job. So I wanted to know from you, I suppose, how the workers managed to unite to have such an effective strike, because as I understand it, you all work on your own. It's not, there isn't a shop floor where you've got loads of workers working together. But even though you're all visiting houses on your own, you've managed to really build quite an effective strike action. So, I mean, how did that happen? What was the process there?
So the way that we've kind of come together, I have to really hand it to the GMB here. They've been holding near weekly webinars, which we've all been dialing into, and they've been keeping us up to date. And in particular, the organisers have really found a way of, getting the message across and keeping the spirits up, because what I found during this strike is it's a bit of a roller coaster of emotions. You're high one day because you think, we're turning a corner here, and then you get an email from the business the following day and you're down again. Like I say, the GMB have done a really good job of rallying it. As well as that, there's also been engineers from across the country on Twitter, linking up together. The sort of solidarity there, I think, has really emboldened the strike. It's great to keep in touch with, people that you would never really meet, just to get their thoughts on it. And it's great to know that you're not alone in this. Others are feeling the same as you. And yeah.
Daniel Caie, thank you so much for speaking to us to explain the strike, and all of our solidarity. I mean, it seems completely outrageous, this fire and rehire threat, and massive respect for going out on strike for 27 days. Keep it up, I suppose. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. We're going to go to our final story. Before I do that, I'm going to go to a comment which is from Leanna Mark with €10. Thank you so much. Hi, Michael. Please wish my big brother Sean Luca a happy birthday for tomorrow. Happy birthday for tomorrow, Sean Luca. He's a big fan and it'll make him happy. I love to make people happy. Novara brings us together 3 times a week. What a lovely comment. Happy birthday to Sean Luca. Now, Sean Bailey is the Tory candidate to become London mayor at this mayor's election. He starts the race as the underdog, currently trailing Sadiq Khan by 21 points. That's according to the latest YouGov poll. And his headline-grabbing policies, such as offering incentives for businesses to drug test their employees or allowing large corporations to rename tube stations after themselves, don't appear to be doing much to boost his popularity. Also concerning for the Tory party, who have apparently discussed replacing Bailey as their candidate, is his propensity for gaffes. Bailey's habit of putting his foot in his mouth was apparent again this week when he said this to the London Assembly's Economy Committee. This was a debate, universal income.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our guests. It's a very interesting conversation. I would just like to pose a few things that I'd like to answer. Firstly, your estimation seems to have no nodding towards the human condition. I've been a youth worker for over 20 years. I know some people would absolutely fly if you gave them, a lump sum to deal with every week. I know some people who would buy lots of drugs. So where is the care in this? Where is the care for the person? How do you get past just universally giving people money?
Yes, the reason Bailey gave for opposing a UBI was that people would just blow it all on drugs. That's how much respect he has for the people of London, who he wants to govern. Now, you'll have noticed from that video that the authority Bailey brought to that discussion was his 20 years as a youth worker. So it's more than a little embarrassing that his latest piece of electoral literature poses some doubts about that pedigree. So this is from a leaflet that went through people's, or some people's letterboxes in London. And you've got here Beth, one of the young people Sean helped as a youth worker, who's giving her, review of Sean Bailey, her experience of Sean Bailey. And Beth writes, I used to get into trouble a fair bit, typical stuff for a lad from a council estate. So I struggled to get a job. But then I met Sean. He looked past all that and helped me get myself together and turn things around. Now, maybe Beth does describe herself as a lad from a council estate. I'm, of course, all for gender fluidity. People can refer to themselves how they like. But might it be more likely that actually she doesn't exist? Moya, I want your take on Sean Bailey's gaffe-prone mayoral campaign.
Sean Bailey. We love Sean Bailey, the Labour psyop. He loves fake news. He loves to defend the police. He's already been reported to the CPS in January for a leaflet alleging a 21% hike in council tax across London. And it's funny because these are the tactics that won the Tories the 2019 election. 88% of their ads were misleading, but it doesn't work in London when he does stuff like his TfL bailout facts website. People, because it's a Labour city, people just are like, "What are you doing? This makes no sense." I think it's fascinating how bad a candidate he is, and I do wonder if it's that perhaps the Tories have given up on taking over the city at the moment because it's firmly in Sadiq Khan's hands. It does seem to be a bit of a Labour stronghold right now. And we instead should look to what they're trying to do to the powers of the mayoralty. I think the TfL bailout was a really good example of this. It came with all these conditions. They had to increase the debts, they were increasing fares. It was like Sadiq was sort of backed into a corner. And there have been, I think, murmurs from, the people who keep an eye on localised government, that the Tories instead are now pivoting from trying to put a Tory mayor in place, which, Sean Bailey's not going to do it, I don't think, unless something goes very wrong, knock on wood. But instead, their centralised government are going to try and just limit the powers that the London mayor has. And, there's been changes to planning laws that reduce local government power that affect London. There's been appointing Johnson allies, like I think Andrew Gilligan, to the TfL board, withholding funding when other districts do get that funding. So it's making Khan seem incompetent. And I mean, I'm not going to comment on Khan's actual tenure, but making him seem incompetent by dint of limiting the powers that he has. And I think I read somewhere that the London mayor has almost the least amount of power for any mayor of a capital city in Europe, I believe it was. So that is a way in. And Boris Johnson, I think, has never really... I don't think he's ever considered himself as stepping down from London Mayor, even though he's Prime Minister. I think he still sees himself as someone who can govern London better than Sadiq Khan can, and wants to make it so that he can do that. So perhaps while we all laugh at Bailey, we should be looking to what the Tories are doing instead to make sure they have control over London and this like economic capital.
No, I think that's a spot on analysis actually, but it is, you know, the Tories are giving up on London electorally, so instead they're just going to try and reduce the electoral, I suppose, autonomy of London. So they're trying to reduce the powers of the mayor instead of bothering to try and win the mayoralty. It is interesting, though, that it's, you know, we think now of London as an obviously Labour city, but Boris Johnson was mayor of London for 8 years. It was only 4 years ago, well, now 5 because the election was postponed, but 5 years ago that London was governed by a Tory, and now it just seems completely unimaginable. Let's go to one more gaffe from Bailey, even though he's going to lose, and obviously the Tory strategy is going to be to defeat Sadiq Khan by other means, by non-electoral means. But let's just go to one more Bailey gaffe for the hell of it. So this is very recent as well. This is from December, I think, when asked, from January, in fact, when asked by Inside Housing how his shared ownership scheme would help homeless families. So this is another of his big policy offers. Bailey suggested they could just save up for the £5,000 deposit to join up. So you can see there, homeless families could save for mortgage deposits, says Conservative candidate for London Mayor. Now, I think in terms of have the Tories intentionally put a bad candidate in for London Mayor, I think it's probably more likely that no one who is of stature in the Tory party wants to stand for London Mayor because they're so confident they're going to lose, which is why you've got Sean Bailey, who is stuck there. What do you see happening in the London Mayor elections? Do you think that it is just going to be a home run for Sadiq Khan, or do you think he should also be worrying about, for example, the Green candidate or the Lib Dem candidate, or should we basically, you know, just we don't need to bother watching the mayoralty election? It's probably going to be quite a boring run where we know who's going to win and no one else is going to come close.
It's an interesting question, because at the moment the predictions are that Sadiq Khan could be the first mayor in history to win it on first preference alone. However, I do know that more of the Labour left, which is so funny that I'm even referring to the Labour left, just within my own personal circles, are considering voting Green. So there could be a slight increase in the Green vote, but it could also be at the last moment that because of the Tory stranglehold over the rest of the country, everyone just goes, you know what, I'm going to play it safe and I'm going to vote for Sadiq. So it's difficult. It really is difficult. I think the Lib Dems will lose votes personally, but who knows? The politically homeless, as they love to call themselves, might just end up being like protest vote for the Lib Dems, which is hilarious to me. But no, I think my overall prediction, and I'm terrible at making predictions, so this will probably be complete opposite, is that Sadiq will win on first preferences. Sean Bailey will get very low votes. The Greens will slightly increase their vote share, and it will be Labour, disgruntled left-wing young Labour voters who are voting for Sean Berry.
Yeah, but the Greens will come third. So the Greens will come ahead of the Lib Dems, which I think
the Greens will come ahead of the Lib Dems.
Yeah, that'll be the one. I mean, obviously, it's good that Sadiq Khan gets re-elected, but it's not very exciting. So the change we want to see is the Greens beating the Lib Dems, ideally beating the Tories. That would be exciting.
That would be fantastic. That would be wonderful.
Sadiq Khan under pressure in 4 years' time. We are going to wrap up the show there. Moya, it's been an absolute pleasure to be joined by you for Tysky Sour this evening. We'll have to have you back on soon.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I'm sorry to Nicholas Witchell.
Well, at least you remembered his name. I couldn't remember what the guy. That's why I called him an old guy, because I was like, I should have written in my notes what his name was. Anyway, if you haven't already, do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you do so already, thank you so much. Please also do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the like button. It helps us on the algorithm. I'll be back on Monday at 7 p.m. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.